macOS targeted malware has been on the rise.
Hello and welcome to episode 2, season 2 of your Cyber Threat Intelligence podcast. Whether you're a seasoned CTI expert, a cybersecurity professional, or simply curious about the digital battlefield, our expert guests and hosts will break down complex topics into actionable insights. On this episode of Season 2, our host Pedro Kertzman will chat with Olivia Gallucci, who is a security engineer with deep expertise in macOS internals, reverse engineering, and user space research. Olivia has presented at multiple conferences, such as Black Hat, DEF CON, and several security B-sides, just to name a few. Olivia is also recipient of multiple awards, including from Women in Cybersecurity, and she is always bringing important awareness related to the security of macOS operating systems to a broader audience. Over to you, Pedro.
Olivia, thank you so much for coming to the show. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So today we're going to deep dive on the cyber part of CTI, and we're going to talk about macOS, which is probably one of my favorite ones. Olivia, do you think we are past that fairy tale about Macs are secure by default, don't need security? What is your thoughts around that fairy tale?
Yeah, the idea that Macs are secure by default, I think, is increasingly regarded as a myth. Weirdly, I still do see it occasionally, especially among developers and consumers. Yeah. But within IT and security engineers, it's usually regarded as a joke. In recent years, macOS has faced a surge of issues, and I think amongst the security community, it has ended up really dispelling that notion that built-in protections alone can keep consumers or enterprises safe. In general, I think treating macOS or any system as inherently safe can lead to like a lot of blind spots, and my personal advice would be to monitor Apple like all Apple OSs the same as you would any other OS like a Linux, a Windows, or Android.
That's a great advice. Thank you. And how, your story with macOS came to be, how you bump into that probably in the past.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I switched schools and I went to a school that had a robotics program, and I got really into programming and open source software because the open source community would help me do so much stuff despite not being related to what their goals were. I was like, hey, I have this bug. Can someone help me fix it? And they were like, sure. And I was really touched by this open source community. And then I'd watch this documentary on the anonymous hacker group. And I was like, okay, I want to do open source offensive security. I began writing opinion pieces and blogs and stuff online about, the open source software community and Debian and various other open source operating systems. And at some point, I had really gotten passionate about pointing out some of the claims Apple was making and how things weren't really aligned up. And so I was quite critical of Apple. And one of the red team managers there reached out to me and was like, hey, at Apple, we appreciate Think Different. I'd love for you to come work here. And during that interview process, I found a vulnerability, literally during the interview process.
Holy.
And that really went well. So that was kind of how I got into the Mac space. But before that, I hadn't touched a Mac in 7 years. And so I had I started off as an intern there and I had a really great experience there. So
that's amazing.
That's how I got.
That's amazing. Imagine how many points you get to find a vulnerability during the interview process, right? That's quite unique. That's nice.
Yeah.
From an endpoint visibility standpoint, what are the things that, for example, you can't see on the Mac OS, like blind spots, anything around that? Macs work differently. Apple provide gazillion APIs for security or any other vendors to hook into. Any thoughts around best practices on that side of things?
Yeah. So Mac and Apple and all of its OSs have kind of had this strange history because at different points in times, there's been things obfuscated or things hidden, and then things also open source. Like Apple has over 400 open source repositories available on GitHub. And it kind of shifts the conversation to, what system you're talking about and then what timeline. So today, macOS imposes certain restrictions that, yes, create blind spots and endpoint monitoring. So one example of this would be like Apple's unified logging system. It's off limit to third-party security tools without special entitlements, meaning that like EDRs or AVs or any sort of endpoint security tool cannot read system logs for standard threat telemetry in a super easy and accessible way. However, it's not just endpoint monitoring that's affected. Even just like the standard red team engineer or researcher might have problems day to day if they don't have a dedicated test machine. Like Apple's system integrity protection prevents techniques like user mode hooking of processes. And as a result, legacy endpoint solutions that relied on injecting code into running apps are now, foiled. Today as well, Apple provides something known as the Endpoint Security API for authorized monitoring. This is an awesome solution, but not all system activity is exposed through it. And combined, these limitations plus Apple's strict APIs mean that some malicious behaviors or system changes on macOS might go unseen by security software, in contrast to the deep visibility that I guess other OSs provide and have normalized like Windows and Linux.
And let's say, again, comparing those different operating systems and how security-wise people can help protect them. One common example these days is like living off the land techniques or LOLBins, bring your own binaries, or any living off the land related techniques on the other OSs. Is that also a thing on macOS, or how's that working on that particular scenario?
Yeah, so we have the living off the land attacks on Mac, which is essentially just allowing legit system binaries to execute malicious tasks. Within the Apple security community, I think they're called LOLBins, or living off the orchard binaries. Okay. And there's a standard list somewhere. It's over 30 built-in macOS binaries and scripts have been to be exploitable for yikes purposes. Common examples of this include OssaScript, which is the command line tool used to run AppleScript and JavaScript for automation. And people will use this to execute malicious scripts. And then there's curl, which I think is available everywhere to download payloads instead of dropping obvious malware files. So, by using these native tools, like Apple provided apps like Bash, LaunchCTL, OssaScript, etc., these attacks blend in normal system activity and can bypass certain security filters. And such LOLBin tactics have been observed at multiple stages of Mac attacks, from the initial infection, like using curl or OssaScript in a macro or one-liner command, to the post-compromise actions using admin tools like DSCL for reconnaissance. I guess the TLDR is that, Mac, like all OSs, kind of has its own group of pre-installed binaries that attackers can repurpose. And this can also make detections a little bit harder because the tools being used are actually legitimate programs. That said, it's always good to use the tools that, Mac and Apple makes available, using Apple's official security frameworks to the fullest extent, while acknowledging that there might be some blind spots because of these attacks.
No, that's awesome. It's pretty much like you say a Windows operating system, PowerShell. You cannot block the application, right? But you have to understand the behavior, the commands, and how the user or applications are leveraging that underlying technology on the OS itself. That makes total sense. Thank you. And the other, other than living off the land, the other super common or fairly common scenario these days, it's attacks that as an industry we recognize as supply chain attacks. Is that also a thing in the macOS reality?
100%. And I think there's largely two groups of supply chain attacks on Mac. So there's the developer and software supply chain side, and then there's the user-facing vectors and the trust chain. To go into that first part, the macOS ecosystem has seen supply attacks targeting software developers and the common softwares that they rely on. I remember in 2024, there was a pretty serious vulnerability. There might have been multiple. And it's a package manager called CocoaPods. It raised the alarms because attackers could inject malicious code into iOS and macOS apps by hijacking third-party dependencies. Also, people have actively planted malware in development tools and libraries. One campaign in 2025 poisoned a Python package to pull a macOS version of Coldbox Strike. And this effectively compromised Macs through a seemingly legit like open source component. And as a group, these scenarios kind of show how attackers exploit that trust that developers place in frameworks and packages. To get into that second group, there's those user-facing areas. Here, the end users are also targeted via like macro malware and trojanized apps. So Macs are not, immune to social engineering. Office macros remain a threat on Mac. So like Microsoft Office for Mac supports VBA macros, just like on Windows. So an unsuspecting user who enables macros in a malicious document can execute malware on macOS. Attackers have also distributed trojanized apps and fake updates to Mac users. For example, like a malicious DMG installer masquerading as a cracked or popular app can deliver malware. This became super popular with info stealers like Amos. Like that's one of the main techniques that they use. And then compounding on this issue, Apple's own code signing and app notarization mechanisms, while adding really great security, they're not foolproof. There's been instances of Apple notarized malware slipping through automated checks, meaning that malware might arrive digitally signed and notarized by Apple on your machine.
Holy.
So this abuse shows that even a trusted signature or an Apple notary ticket doesn't guarantee safety. So to me, macOS faces supply chain risks at multiple levels, from that developer pipeline, like vulnerable package repositories and tampered tooling, to the end user, like the malicious Office docs, the trojanized installers, and even occasionally subverted code signing. Again, I think, being mindful and having verification at each step is best rather than relying on assumed trust.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you touched on a very interesting point. I hear more and more. It's related to, let's say, secure by design principles, software dependencies, right? You touched on that. And if you don't check that as a developer or as a security practitioner, maybe you need to go reverse engineer things to find out what's the underlying dependencies that you're actually agreeing to use without knowing that, just by running a software. It's so important because we usually find out or hear more about dependencies when some open source super used log4j example is used across the board. That goes south, and then you see the industries was basically entirely, or for the most part, relying on things like that. If you think about macOS, the reality of security for macOS versus the things we still have on the, let's say, marketing side, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, Apple has long promoted macOS as a secure platform, but with most things, the reality is more complex. Yes, macOS benefits from strong security by design, the Unix-based architecture, the sandboxing, notarization requirements, and the many amazing features that Apple's built on top of, plus many other things that were implemented into ARM and the hardware and all that. Yet, recent years have really proven that it is far from impervious. So like macOS targeted malware has been on the rise like really sharply for the past 2 years. So 2024 and 2025 saw a noticeable uptick in macOS focused threats, from the InfoSealer malware as a service to nation state spyware. In fact, this is part of the reason why like my career kind of kicked off outside of Apple, because a lot of people like didn't really understand why I was even focusing in this area. But when InfoSealers came along, they were like, oh, maybe Mac security like actually matters. And attackers really recognized that the enterprises, like they're starting to adapt Apple products, and they're becoming this like growing user base of Macs in these enterprise environments. And that's a lot of money. So the old marketing notions that, Macs don't get viruses has been, in my opinion, thoroughly debunked. But again, there's that lingering perception that persists among like the average consumers and some developers. And this misconception can breed a false sense of security. In reality, I think macOS now faces many of the same threats as other OSs. To give like two examples, like I'd say like ransomware groups, I remember like a bunch of them started actually adopting their Windows and Linux payloads to Mac. And like in 2022, I think it was, macOS malware was predicted to make up around like 6% of all infections in 2022. I think this was according to a company called Securionix. And every single time, like I read a new article, it's like, it's no longer 6%, it's like 13% or 15%. And it's just like that number has just been climbing, like regardless of really where you look. And I'd warn that over reliance on Apple's built-in protections like Gatekeeper, Xprotect, and sandboxing is unwise, because these measures can only catch some of the attacks due to most of them using social engineering. And hackers just continuously find ways around them. So the security marketing around macOS being virus-free or requiring no extra protection no longer holds true. And I think the person that is going to suffer the most from this will be the average consumer.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think also with that statistics of the increasing attacks and compromises, users probably changed. Back in the day, we mostly saw Macs on marketing or digital related like roles. Now, like programmers, people with root access to other things, like more, let's say, juicy admin rights for threat actors and you name it, directors like C-level. They always have their own Macs. Everybody has Windows. That guy has a Mac.
Yeah, 100%. The users have definitely changed. Apple was seen as almost a status symbol for many years. And I think to a degree today it still is. Like I remember when I was in high school, and it was almost like a class differentiator of like who could afford a Mac versus like who had a Windows machine.
Yeah.
And there was a select like subset of kids who were like, I have a Linux machine. And some of these kids were kids who were like, oh, I want my computer to run faster. But a lot of these kids were the kids that you would consider technical. And throughout college, I noticed like most people use Linux. A lot of the environments I was in were, Linux heavy, especially for developers and all of that. And then I don't know what shifted, but something definitely did shift. I think maybe it was like the M1, the M2, like that processing power. And I think AI and needing to have that processing power locally and wanting to have that sleekness with it. I think it was something with that. That's not something that I could say back up with a study or anything like that. But there was 100% a user shift. And today, a lot of developer environments I see now either mix all three of these operating systems or are Mac heavy. I've seen some companies be still Windows heavy, but those are usually ones in like finances or retail professions that have been a little bit older than, say, the standard of like, I'm going to, vibe code app. Like most of those I think are Mac heavy people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I saw another day like a little joke that guy was on an airplane coding, no internet, no AI support, no Stack Overflow, just coding like an animal from memory right there. Like it's and it was a Mac. Right. So it's
wow. That surprises me. That actually really surprises me. I feel like to this day, still like Linux users, and they can beat me at anything. Like they're like, yeah, I have this like kernel module I put, and I'm like, that's amazing. Like I wish I knew what you were doing.
Yeah, kernel is like serious stuff. If you go down that path, it's interesting. Yeah, I admire who can do that. But Olivia, any other thoughts, suggestions for people using Macs or planning to use Macs on the security side of things? Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think the best thing users can do is if this is a macOS specific advice, there's an amazing open source software repository or software, account on GitHub called Objective-C. And this account has all of these amazing security softwares. They're all open source. You can see what they're doing. And each one does a different thing. So one of them can tell you if an application is currently accessing or using your camera or microphone. One tactic that malware uses is it will change your volume or access your camera or microphone, and it will just tell you when that happens. Another one that's there, it will show you if someone has tried to like tamper with your machine where you weren't around. Like I think it takes a picture of like the person who's like trying to log in. If that's happening, some of them will show you if like a new system extension has been added to your machine. And pretty much anyone can like benefit from having these extra security protections. I think the original intent was to help like journalists and stuff, but the average malware now on Mac attacks these same things. So it's just a good extra safety protection. And it's something that is accessible and easy for the average person to install and use. And make a shout out to Patrick Wardle for creating those tools and making Mac security accessible to the average user.
That's awesome. Olivia, thank you so much for all the insights. Really appreciate you coming to the show. And I hope I'll see you around. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Got thoughts or questions? Connect with us on our LinkedIn group, Cyber Threat Intelligence Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. If you know anyone with CTI expertise that would like to be interviewed in the show, just let us know. Until next time, stay sharp and stay secure.